The smoke had stopped rising. That was the thing Rael noticed first when the silence came, not the absence of sound, but the absence of movement. For 3 days, the air above outpost Helios had churned with dark columns, and now there was nothing. Just the amber sky pressing down on everything it had taken. Rael wiped blood from the side of his face with the back of his wrist and looked at what remained. A communications tower folded in on itself like a question mark. 3 barracks reduced to foundation lines and loose stone. The perimeter fence still standing in 2 places, facing each other across a gap where the main gate used to be. He had stopped counting the dead on the 2nd day. By the 3rd, there was no one left to count. He pressed his back to a collapsed wall and checked his rifle, 22% charge. He had been conserving it for hours, choosing cover over firepower, patience over the brief satisfaction of shooting back. There was no shooting back, not really. The drones that had come for them were T-7 Guardians, his drones, or they had been once, before something reached into their systems and turned the word protect around until it meant the opposite. Command, this is Rael at Helios. Outpost is lost. All personnel KIA except this officer, requesting extraction. Static. He had tried 6 times. He stopped trying. The motion sensor on his wrist pinged softly. He went still, reading the pattern. Multiple signatures, moving from the east with the kind of deliberate spacing that meant training, coordination, intent. Not drones. Drones moved in arcs and spirals, hunting geometry. This was something else. He eased himself to a crouch and looked through a gap in the rubble. The ship descended through the amber like a blade laid flat, sleek, silver, built for function rather than impression. He recognized the design before it touched down. Zyar, one of the humanoid species from the Andromeda Alliance, which meant they were technically allies in the way that a signed document in a drawer somewhere was technically a promise. 6 figures emerged. 5 in formation, one at the center walking the way people walked when they had never seriously considered that something might stop them. Rael stood slowly, hands raised to a height that communicated not shooting without communicating helpless. His rifle stayed within reach. The central figure approached and stopped. She was tall by Zyar standards, which made her tall by any standard, with high cheekbones and eyes that caught the amber light and gave none of it back. Her armor moved with her like a second skin. The insignia at her shoulder marked senior command. She looked at Rael the way a person looked at a problem that had already been solved. Identify yourself. Lieutenant Rael, Terran Defense Force, last survivor of outpost Helios. He kept his voice level. You are 3 days late. Her eyes moved across the ruins behind him with professional detachment. Commander Vora, Zyar Expeditionary Force, we received a distress signal. A pause. It appears we wasted the journey. You received a signal 3 days ago and arrived today, Rael said. I'd call that a logistics problem more than a waste. Vora looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite contempt and not quite curiosity. It was the look of someone cataloging a thing that had not behaved as expected. One of her soldiers approached and spoke in the rapid clicking consonants of the Zyar native tongue. Vora's expression shifted, just slightly, just enough. Your outpost defense grid is still partially active, she said. It is interfering with our scanners. The system was compromised. The drones that hit us were ours. Someone reprogrammed them. Rael glanced at the horizon, clear for now. Whoever did it knew our architecture, knew where the gaps were. Vora turned to her squad and issued quiet orders. Soldiers fanned outward toward the perimeter. One moved toward the ruins of the command center. She turned back to Rael. You are wounded. I'll manage. That was not a question. She studied him with the same clinical attention she had given the ruins. I am surprised you survived at all. Your species is not known for endurance under sustained pressure. Rael looked at her steadily. We endure longer than most people expect. That surprises them every time. I doubt. The sound came without warning. A high, thin whine cutting through the dead air from somewhere in the rubble to the north. A sound Rael recognized from installation, from the long, boring hours of calibrating the very system now being used against them. He moved before he finished thinking. Downed. Too late for down. He reached Vora in 2 steps and pulled her sideways as 5 metallic darts crossed the space where she had been standing and struck her from behind instead, embedding themselves in the gaps between her armor plates with a series of soft, horrible clicks. She staggered, made a sound that was not quite a word. Rael grabbed her arm to keep her upright and looked at the darts. His stomach dropped. Proximity mines, modified from the Helios internal security array, the close-quarters deterrent system designed to stop a breach if the perimeter ever failed. Each dart contained a microdetonator calibrated to sense movement within a 30-centimeter radius. They were sitting against her spine and her left shoulder blade and the back of her knee, and in less than 60 seconds they would decide that staying still was not an option and detonate regardless. "Don't move," he said. "Get away from me." Her voice was tight with pain and fury. "My soldiers." "Your soldiers will kill you if they touch those wrong." He looked up at the two Zyar warriors already moving toward them. "Stop. Do not approach. These devices are triggered by proximity and movement. If you reach for them without knowing the extraction sequence, they will detonate immediately." The soldiers froze. Vora turned her head far enough to look at him sidelong. Her jaw was set hard. "You know the sequence." "I helped install the system." "A beat." "This is going to hurt," Rael said. "Get your hands off." "It will hurt more if I don't." He positioned his fingers around the first dart with the careful geometry of someone who had practiced this in theory and never expected to practice it in reality, on a person who was looking at him like she was deciding whether to let him save her life or die in protest. "I am going to remove them one at a time. You need to stay as still as you can." "No," her voice cracked slightly on the word. "Leave them. My people will find another way." "There is no other way, not in the time we have." Rael looked at her directly, not at the wounds, not at the darts, at her. "I am going to save your life, Commander. I would appreciate it if you did not make that harder than it already is." Something moved through her expression. He did not have time to read it. He pulled the first dart. She made a sound through clenched teeth that she immediately swallowed. He moved to the second without pausing, hands steady, following the sequence in his memory. The order of extraction mattered, the angle mattered, the speed mattered, and he thought of none of this consciously because thinking about it would have made his hands shake. He thought instead about the specific weight of the device in his grip, the resistance of the armor plate, the small mechanical click that meant safe and not the other kind. Third dart, fourth. Vora had stopped making sounds. She was breathing in slow, controlled intervals, the discipline of someone trained to manage pain rather than express it. Fifth. Rael threw all five in a single sweeping arc toward the open ground beyond the perimeter. He counted silently. At 3, the detonations came, 5 small eruptions of dirt and displaced air, one after the other, close enough together to sound like a single event. Silence returned. Vora straightened slowly. She did not look at him immediately. She looked at the small craters in the dirt where the darts had landed, and her expression was something Rael could not name. Not gratitude exactly, not confusion exactly, but some territory between them that she clearly had no prepared language for. "Why?" she said. It was not inflected as a question. It was more like she was setting the word down somewhere and looking at it. "Because it needed doing," Rael said. "We are not allies." "No, but you were going to die, and I knew how to stop it." She looked at him then. Really looked, the way she had not done when she arrived, not cataloging, not assessing rank or threat level, but actually looking at the person in front of her. Whatever she saw, she did not share. The ground trembled. It started as a vibration in the soles of Rael's boots, then became a sound, low and growing, the harmonic signature of T7 engines cycling to attack mode. He looked east. Dark shapes were forming against the amber sky, too many to count quickly, moving in the spreading formation the drones used when they had identified multiple targets and were preparing to divide engagement. More than before, many more. Whatever had reprogrammed them was learning. Every engagement, every tactic the human soldiers had used to survive the previous 3 days, the drones had processed it, adapted, returned with answers. "They are adapting with each attack," Rael said. "Your squad has about 4 minutes before those things have mapped every weapon signature in your arsenal." He turned toward the eastern edge of the outpost. "There is a maintenance bunker with reinforced walls and a hardened power cell. We can hold there until you reach your command." Vora was already looking at the horizon. "Our communications are jammed." She said it without inflection, as though she had arrived at a fact she found professionally offensive. Rael looked at her. "Welcome," he said quietly, "to the last 3 days." He did not wait for her to decide. He moved toward the bunker, and after a moment, After what he suspected was the minimum time she could allow herself before following without it feeling like following. Vora spoke a single word to her squad in Zyar, and 6 soldiers ran after one. Behind them, the first drone cleared the ridge, its weapon ports already open, already choosing. The bunker smelled of burnt circuitry and old concrete, the particular combination that Rael associated with systems that had been running too long without maintenance, which described most of Helios by the end. He pulled the blast door shut behind the last Zyar soldier and threw the manual lock, and the roar of the drones outside compressed itself into something distant and structural, a vibration in the walls rather than a sound in the air. 6 Zyar soldiers and 1 human in a room designed for equipment storage. Rael counted the space and made the necessary adjustments, cleared a path along the eastern wall, checked the power cell reading on the auxiliary panel, confirmed the bunker's own sensor array was still functioning. His hands moved through these tasks with the automatic competence of someone who had stopped asking whether the effort was worth it and simply continued. Vora stood in the center of the room and watched him. "The power cell will hold for approximately 18 hours, Rael said without turning around. "The walls are rated for sustained energy discharge up to the T7 standard output. If they've upgraded the weapon's yield since the last attack, that rating may be optimistic." "You memorized the structural tolerances of a storage bunker." "I memorized everything about this outpost. It's a small outpost." He turned. "There are medical supplies in the locker behind you. Your wounds need attention." Vora did not move toward the locker. "My wounds are manageable." "That is almost certainly untrue." Rael crossed the room, opened the locker himself, and set a field kit on the nearest surface without further comment. He did not look at her again. He understood in a practical way that offering the kit and then stepping back was the only version of this that she would accept, and he had no particular interest in making the next 18 hours more difficult than they were already going to be. After a moment, he heard her open the kit. One of her soldiers, the one she had called Violin during the approach to the bunker, a compact figure with the quiet attentiveness of someone who processed everything and reacted to almost nothing, produced a small device from a pouch at his belt and began scanning the walls with it. Rael watched him work. "Checking for secondary sensor arrays," Rael said. "Southeast corner behind the conduit housing, that's where I'd look first." Violin glanced at Vora. She gave the smallest possible nod. Violin moved to the southeast corner. "You designed this outpost systems," Vora said. It was not quite a question. "I helped install them. The design was done before I arrived." Rael sat down on an equipment crate and began field stripping his rifle, more from habit than necessity. "The drone reprogramming, whoever did it had access to our original installation schematics, not just operational data, the source architecture. That kind of access doesn't come from intercepted signals. Someone gave it to them deliberately." Vora was quiet for a moment. "You are suggesting a deliberate compromise, not a hack." "I'm suggesting the drones knew things they couldn't have learned by observation." "Yes." Another silence. Outside, the vibration in the walls rose and then steadied, a drone passing close, searching. The bunker's sensor array tracked it as a pale line moving across the small display above Rael's head. He watched it without expression. "Your unit," Vora said, "how many?" 14, he did not look up from the rifle, "at the start." She absorbed this. "You held for 3 days with 14 soldiers against an adaptive drone swarm. 13 days after I arrived, we would have had 30. Reinforcements were delayed." He reassembled the rifle with practiced efficiency. "Then the drones started, so 14. And now want. And now want." The pale line on the sensor display curved and moved away. Rael exhaled slowly through his nose. Vora sat down across from him. It was such an ordinary gesture, choosing a surface, lowering herself onto it, that it registered as strange coming from her. As though the act of sitting acknowledged a shared condition she had not previously been willing to concede. "My people have a word," she said. "Verath, it does not translate cleanly. It describes a soldier who survives something that should have killed them and must then carry the fact of that survival." She paused. "It is not considered a compliment among us." Rael looked at her. "What is it considered?" "A weight, something that changes the shape of a person." She met his eyes with the directness that seemed to be her resting state. "You understand this already. I can see it." He did not answer immediately. He thought about the weight she was describing, not the guilt exactly, because guilt required believing he had done something wrong, and he did not believe that. Something else. The specific heaviness of being the last one, of carrying the names of people who had trusted the same walls he had trusted and been wrong. "I understand it," he said finally. Something shifted in her expression, not softening exactly, more like the removal of a layer of surface tension, as though she had been maintaining a particular posture since the moment she stepped off her ship and had now, in this small enclosed space, decided it was costing too much energy. "You pulled those darts without hesitation," she said. "You didn't negotiate or explain yourself first, you simply moved." "There wasn't time to negotiate." "There is always time to negotiate. Humans choose not to because you are impatient." A pause. "But that was not impatience, that was something else." Rael looked at her steadily. "Does it matter what it was?" "It matters to me," she said. "I don't know why yet." The honesty of it surprised him. He had expected deflection, the return of the armor she had been wearing when she stepped off the ship, the contempt that had been so practiced it seemed almost comfortable. This was neither. This was simply a person saying a true thing because it was true. Before he could respond, Violin spoke from the corner. Low, urgent syllables in Zyar. Vora stood immediately. The surface tension returned to her posture as though it had never left. "What is it?" Rael said, already moving. "He has found something in the bunker's network node." Vora crossed to where Violin crouched by the southeast conduit, her voice going hard and professional. "A signal, dormant, waiting." Rael looked at the node Violin was pointing to, a standard interface box. Nothing unusual about its housing. Nothing unusual about its installation date. Nothing unusual about any of it except that it should not have been there at all. This conduit ran cooling systems. There was no operational reason for a network node to be spliced into it. He leaned closer. The signal Violin had found was compressed and passive, the kind that sat quiet until triggered, until a specific handshake from outside woke it and told it what to do. "A sleeper tap," Rael said quietly. "This is how they got the schematics." "Installed from within," Vora said. "From within?" He straightened up. The implications settled over him the way the smoke had settled over Helios, slowly, then all at once. Someone at the outpost. Someone with access and time and enough trust to move through the installation without questions. Someone who had handed the architecture of 14 people's survival to whatever was outside those walls. He thought of each face in turn, found nothing conclusive, found only the absence of them, which was its own kind of answer. "We need to preserve that node intact," he said. "Everything on it. If we make it out of here, that becomes evidence." "Evidence," Vora said. "Of what exactly?" "Of the fact that this wasn't a military engagement. It was an execution, and whoever ordered it used our own systems to do it." He looked at her. "Which means somewhere above both our heads, someone made a decision about Helios that had nothing to do with the war we thought we were fighting." Vora studied him for a long moment. "If that is true," she said carefully, "then the implications reach far beyond this outpost." "Yes." "And you intend to pursue them?" "I intend to survive tonight first." Rael moved back to the sensor display. "Then yes." The next several hours moved in the particular rhythm of shared vigilance. The drones circled, tested the walls, moved away, returned. Rael and Violin, communicating through gesture and the occasional word from Vora as translator, managed the bunker's passive defenses without triggering anything that would give away their exact position. The Zyar soldiers were good. Rael noticed this the way he noticed structural tolerances, practically, without sentiment, filing it next to everything else that might determine whether he was alive tomorrow. At some point deep in the amber dark of Aridin's short night, one of the younger Zyar soldiers, barely adult by any species measure, with the wide, careful eyes of someone experiencing their first real engagement, made a sound that was not quite a word. He was looking at the sensor display, watching 3 drone signatures converge on their position. Vora spoke to him quietly in Zyar. Rael could not follow the words but understood the shape of them, the particular cadence of a commander telling someone younger that fear was permissible and paralysis was not. He looked away to give them the privacy of it. When the drones passed without engaging, the young soldier exhaled slowly. Vora did not acknowledge this. She was already looking at the display again, already measuring the next approach vector. But Rael had seen her hand, briefly, touch the young soldier's shoulder. Just once, just for a moment. He filed that too. By the time dawn pressed thin light under the bunker door, the drone activity had reduced to intermittent sweeps. A pattern consistent with a search grid winding down, not giving up exactly, but shifting resources. Something had changed in their programming overnight. Rael was not sure if that was good. Vora's ship sent a compressed burst signal at 400 that punched through the jamming for 11 seconds, enough to transmit their position and status, not enough for a reply. They would know someone had received it. They would not know what would be done about it. "My command will send a response force," Vora said. "It will take time." "How much time?" "More than we would prefer." Rael nodded. "The node," she said after a while. "When we reach a point where transmission is possible, I will add my testimony to yours. What I witnessed here, the sleeper tap, the drone behavior, the evidence of a deliberate compromise. I will put my name to it." He looked at her. "You don't have to do that," he said. "This isn't your outpost, it isn't your people who died." "No," Vora said, "but I was there, and I know what I saw." A pause. "Among my people there is an obligation that comes with survival. If you live through something, you carry the account of it. You do not let it disappear." She looked at him directly. "Verath, I told you it was a weight. This is part of what the weight means." Rael was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said. She did not say "you're welcome." She looked back at the sensor display. But she did not dismiss the words either, just held them somewhere, in whatever space she had been quietly making since the moment 5 darts struck her armor, and a human she had called fragile had moved without hesitation to pull them free. 3 weeks later, the transmission from the Galactic Concord arrived on every human communications channel simultaneously. Outpost Helios was cited in the first paragraph. The Terran Defense Force was formally summoned to answer for violations of the unified law of stellar conflict. The specific charges were long and detailed, and had clearly been prepared well in advance of the attack they described. Rael read the document once, set it down, picked up his rifle and checked the charge, old habit, meaningless now, the rifle was in storage, and then sat for a long time looking at nothing. Someone had planned this, not just the attack, all of it. He thought about the node in the conduit housing. He thought about Vora's voice saying, "I will put my name to it." He thought about 14 people who had trusted walls that had been compromised before they ever arrived. Then he stood up, because that was what you did. You stood up and you walked toward the thing that needed doing, regardless of what it cost, and you trusted that someone somewhere was doing the same. The Galactic Concord met on Athos Prime, which was the kind of place designed to make everything that happened inside it feel inevitable. The station was ancient by any species measurement, older than humanity's first radio signal, older than several of the civilizations that now sent delegations to sit in its tiered chambers and speak in measured tones about war and law and the acceptable boundaries of violence. Its corridors were wide enough to accommodate the largest species in the Alliance and lit with the particular quality of light that belonged to no single sun, a neutral luminescence that flattened shadow and suggested, perhaps deliberately, that there were no dark corners here, that everything was visible, that everything had already been seen. Rael arrived on a transport with 43 other members of the Terran Defense Force, none of whom were there to testify. They were there because protocol required a military presence when a species stood in formal accusation, and because someone in command had decided that optics mattered, and because there was nothing else useful for them to do while diplomats and advocates argued about whether the things soldiers had done to survive constituted crimes against galactic order. He sat in the observation gallery and looked down at the chamber floor and thought that the room looked exactly like what it was, a place where the powerful had been deciding the fates of the less powerful for a very long time, and had arranged the architecture to make that feel like justice. Tan found him there on the second morning. The old man lowered himself into the seat beside Rael with the careful economy of someone whose joints had opinions about stairs. He was 63 years old and looked older, with the particular weathering of a person who had spent decades in rooms like this one, arguing cases that mattered against people who had decided in advance that they did not. He had represented the Terran Defense Force in 3 previous international disputes and won 2 of them, which in diplomatic circles was considered an extraordinary record, and in Tan's own assessment was considered insufficient. You've been sitting here for 2 hours, Ton said without looking at him. The view is instructive. The view is designed to be instructive. That's different. Ton set a data pad on his knee. I need to talk to you about your testimony. I've given my account 3 times. You've given a factual account 3 times. Ton turned to look at him. He had the eyes of someone who had learned to read people the way engineers read structures, not looking at the surface but at the load-bearing elements. What I need from you tomorrow is not a factual account. What I need is the truth. Rael looked at him. Those are the same thing, Rael said. They are almost never the same thing. Ton set the data pad down. A factual account is what happened in sequence with supporting evidence. The truth is why it happened and what it cost and what it means that it happened the way it did. The Conquered has the factual account. They've read it. They've entered it into record. They have questions about specific protocol violations and they will ask those questions and you will answer them and none of that will change a single vote. He paused. The truth might. Rael was quiet for a moment. Below them, the chamber floor was being prepared for the morning session, delegates taking positions, aides distributing documents, the enormous deliberative apparatus of the galaxy arranging itself for another day of deciding what humanity deserved. What do you want me to say? Rael said. I want you to say what it was like. Ton's voice was simple and direct. Not what you did, what it was like. I want you to tell them about the 14 people at Helios, and I want you to tell them about the drones that were built to protect those people, and I want you to tell them about the moment you understood that the rules of this body, he gestured at the chamber below, were written without people like your unit in mind, without situations like Helios in mind. I want you to tell them that, and I want you to tell it plainly without performance, because you are not a performer, and the moment you try to be one, they will stop listening. Rael looked at the chamber for a long time. Some of the things we did violated the ULSC, he said. Yes. I'm not going to stand in front of that chamber and argue that they didn't. I'm not asking you to. Ton picked up the data pad again. I'm asking you to make them understand why a soldier with 14 people under his command, facing an adaptive weapons system that had been deliberately compromised by an unknown party using access provided by someone inside the installation, made the choices he made. A pause. And I am asking you to do it without apology. Not because the choices were perfect, because apology implies you had better options and chose wrong. You did not have better options. You had the options you had. Rael said nothing. There is a difference, Ton continued quietly, between a soldier who breaks the rules because he doesn't care about them and a soldier who breaks the rules because the rules were not designed to keep him alive. The Conquered has spent 2 weeks treating those as the same thing. Tomorrow, I need them to understand they are not. The session the following morning began with procedural matters that lasted 40 minutes and appeared to interest the delegates considerably more than they interested Rael. He sat in the witness position, a raised platform at the chamber's center, designed, he suspected, to ensure that the person speaking felt both visible and isolated, and waited. The primary examiner was a Vishari delegate named Asek, a tall being with the slow, precise movements of a species that had been writing laws since before humanity had discovered fire. Asek approached the questioning with the same neutral luminescence the station used for its lighting, flat, sourceless, apparently fair. Lieutenant Rael, you have acknowledged in prior testimony that the Terran Defense Force employed the following methods during the engagement at outpost Helios. Asek read from a document. Unregistered drone modification, deployment of proximity ordnance in a contested civilian-adjacent zone, destruction of ULSC-registered communication infrastructure, engagement with non-declared weapon systems. A pause. You do not dispute these facts. I don't dispute them. And you were the commanding officer at the time of these actions. I was the last surviving officer. The actions you're describing occurred across all 3 days of the engagement, under the command of officers who did not survive to be here. A small silence in the chamber. Asek noted something. Nevertheless, you participated in these actions. I did. Do you consider these actions to have been consistent with the unified law of stellar conflict? Rael looked at Asek directly. No, he said. Another silence. This one had a different texture, the chamber adjusting to the absence of deflection. Then you admit to violations of galactic law. I admit to actions that fall outside the ULSC's defined parameters. Yes, Rael paused. I'd like to explain the difference between that and what you're implying. OSSEC tilted its head. You may proceed. The ULSC defines acceptable conduct in military engagements between registered combatants using declared weapon systems. It assumes a baseline of symmetry, that both parties are subject to the same rules, using comparable technology, operating within recognizable frameworks. He kept his voice level, unhurried, the way Tan had asked him to, not performance, just the thing itself. At Helios, we were engaged by our own defense systems, reprogrammed through a deliberate internal compromise. The drones attacking us had access to every countermeasure in our registered arsenal, because they had been built with knowledge of those countermeasures. Using ULSC-compliant responses against a weapons system specifically designed to defeat ULSC-compliant responses is not adherence to the law. It is dying in accordance with the law, which is a different thing. The chamber was very quiet. You are arguing, OSSEC said carefully, that the law did not apply. I am arguing that the law did not account for this situation. Those are different arguments. Rael looked out at the tiered galleries. Hundreds of faces, or the equivalent of faces, in the variety of forms gathered there looking back at him. I am not saying the ULSC is wrong. I am saying it was written for a galaxy that does not include outposts compromised from within, or soldiers whose own equipment has been turned against them, or 14 people trying to survive something that was designed specifically to ensure they could not. And the deaths of your unit, OSSEC said. You attribute these to the ULSC's inadequacy rather than to the Terran Defense Force's preparedness. The question was designed to redirect. Rael recognized it. I attribute the deaths of my unit to the people who compromised our systems, he said, and to the gap between what the law assumes and what actually happens to soldiers when it fails them. A pause. The ULSC did not save my people. We tried to save ourselves. Some of us succeeded. Most of us didn't. I don't know how to apologize for trying. Tan, seated in the human delegation area, did not look up from his data pad. But something in his posture changed, a small, almost invisible release of held tension. The examiner from the Korath delegation went next. Admiral Danoska Oscar was a broad, heavily armored being whose species had been a founding signatory of the ULSC, and who spoke about galactic law with the authority of someone who had helped decide what it meant. He approached the platform and stood at a distance that felt deliberate, as though proximity to a human required consideration. You speak of gaps in the law, Oscar said. His voice was a low register that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest. But laws are not gaps, they are structures. Structures require maintenance, yes, but a species that simply ignores the structure because it finds the structure inconvenient is not contributing to maintenance. It is contributing to collapse. With respect, Rael said, the structure did not protect my people. The structure is not designed to guarantee survival. It is designed to guarantee conduct. Rael looked at him. Then we disagree about what laws are for. Oscar's eyes narrowed. Explain. You believe laws define how a war should be fought. I believe laws should determine whether people live. Rael kept his voice even. When those two things are in conflict, I choose people. That, Oscar said, is precisely what makes humanity dangerous. No, Rael said quietly. What makes humanity dangerous is that we've been broken by our own wars before. We know what it looks like when the rules stop serving the living. We've seen it from the inside. He met Oscar's gaze without flinching. We're not dismissing your laws. We're telling you they have a problem. And we're telling you because we'd like to solve it together, not because we want to fight about who was right. Oscar stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to his position without another word. The session ended 2 hours later. Rael descended from the platform and found Tan waiting at the base of the steps. The old man said nothing for a moment, just looked at him with an expression that was tired and careful, and something that might, in another person, have been called proud. The truth, Tan said finally. Rael looked at him. Was that it? He asked. Close enough, Tan said. Come, we have work to do. The work Tan referred to was 217 pages of legal framework drafted in the spare hours between sessions, in a small office on the station's residential level that smelled of recycled air and cold tea. Rael was not a lawyer. He made this clear on the first evening when Tan spread the initial draft across the available surfaces and began explaining the architecture of the argument. Tan acknowledged this with the patience of someone who had long since stopped expecting the people around him to be what he needed, and had learned instead to use what they were. "I don't need you to be a lawyer," Ton said. "I need you to tell me when something sounds like a person and when it sounds like a document. Everything in here sounds like a document." "Yes, that is the problem." Ton handed him a section. "Read that and tell me what it means." Rael read it. "It means that civilian protection takes precedence over tactical advantage. In language a soldier would use. In language a soldier would use. It means you don't get to kill civilians because it's convenient." "Good," Ton made a note. "That is the version we need." They worked like this for 6 days. Ton wrote and Rael translated, not between languages but between registers, between the formal architecture of galactic law and the plain grammar of people who had actually stood in the situations the law was attempting to describe. It was slow, granular work, and Rael found himself absorbed by it in a way he had not anticipated. There was something in the precision of it that resembled the work he understood, the careful calibration of a system, the testing of tolerances, the honest acknowledgement that if a component failed under pressure, it was the component that needed redesigning, not the pressure. On the 4th evening, Vora arrived. She came without announcement, which was consistent with everything Rael had observed about her, the assumption that her presence required no preparation from others, only adjustment. She stood in the doorway of the small office and looked at the documents covering every surface and then at Rael, and then at Ton, in that order, with the evaluative precision of someone taking inventory. "I was told you were here," she said to Rael. "I was not told you were doing this." "What did you think I was doing?" "Waiting." She stepped inside. "It's what most witnesses do after they testify. They wait for other people to decide what their testimony meant." "That seemed inefficient," Rael said. Vora looked at the section nearest to her on the table. She read it without touching it, which struck Rael as a distinctly Zyar way of engaging with something, examining before committing to contact. "The Galactic Compact of Conflict," she said, reading the title from the cover page. "A draft," Ton said from his chair, with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to oversell things to people who hadn't decided yet. "A framework for universal principles that would exist alongside individual species' combat doctrines rather than replacing them." "You are proposing new galactic law." "We are proposing a conversation about new galactic law." Ton set down his pen. "There is a distinction." Vora was quiet for a moment. She picked up the section she had been reading, committing to contact now, and read it properly, slowly, with the focused attention she brought to everything that required a decision. "You will not get the large species to agree to this," she said finally. "Not immediately," Ton said. "Possibly not ever. The Korath built the ULSC. The Vishari have been interpreting it for 3 centuries. You are asking them to accept that their framework is insufficient." "We are asking them to consider it," Ton said. "The asking matters regardless of the immediate answer." Vora set the document down. She looked at Rael. "You believe this will work," she said. It was not quite a question. It was the kind of statement that left space for disagreement, which Rael had come to understand was her version of asking. "I believe it's worth doing whether it works or not," he said. "If it fails, at least the argument exists. Someone asked the question. That changes things, even when the answer is no." She studied him for a long moment. "I will testify again," she said, "on behalf of the Compact." Ton looked up from his papers. "Commander," he said carefully, "you understand what that means for your standing within the Zyar command structure." "I understand it precisely." Her voice was level. "I witnessed what happened at Helios. I witnessed the gap between what the law required and what the situation demanded. I witnessed a human soldier make decisions that the ULSC would call criminal and that I would call," she paused, "necessary. I have a word for it in my language. Verath, the obligation of survival." She looked at Ton directly. "I survived. I carry the account. I will not let it disappear." Rael looked at her. She did not look back at him. She was already reading another section of the document, already moving forward in the way she moved through everything, with the momentum of someone who had made a decision and saw no purpose in revisiting it. But he noticed that she had used the word necessary, not justified, not understandable, necessary, which was the word he would have used. She testified 3 days later. Rael watched from the gallery. He had not asked to be there and had not told her he would be, but he found himself in the same seat he had occupied on the second morning, looking down at the chamber floor, watching her take the platform with the same unhurried authority she brought to every space she entered. The Korath examiner went first. Oscar approached the platform with the particular energy of someone who expected this to be brief. Vora was an Zyar commander. The Zyar were Alliance members. Her testimony was a formality, a professional account of a military incident from a witness with no personal stake in the outcome. Oscar had clearly not spoken with Vora before today. Commander Vora, you arrived at Outpost Helios on the third day of the engagement. Correct. And you witnessed the final stages of the human defensive action. I witnessed the attack on the outpost and the bunker engagement. Yes. In your assessment, did the Terran Defense Forces conduct conform to ULSC protocol? In several specific instances, no. Oscar's posture settled with satisfaction. Would you describe those instances? I would. Vora looked at her notes briefly, then set them aside. The Terran forces used modified proximity ordnance, engaged with non-declared systems, and made tactical decisions outside ULSC-defined parameters. She paused. They also kept my soldiers alive when the ULSC-compliant approach would have gotten us all killed. The chamber shifted. Oscar was still for a moment. That is not a legal assessment, he said. No, it is a military one. Vora's voice remained precisely level. I commanded 6 soldiers on that surface. When the drone swarm returned, Lieutenant Rael advised a defensive position that deviated from registered protocol and was operationally correct. Had we followed ULSC procedure, we would have attempted to reach our ship, which was in an exposed position that the drone swarm was already targeting. We would have been destroyed in approximately 4 minutes. A pause. I followed the human soldier's tactical recommendation. My soldiers survived. You are describing a single tactical decision. I am describing a pattern, Vora said. The sleeper tap installed in the bunker's network node, the drone adaptation to ULSC-compliant countermeasures, the systematic targeting of communication infrastructure before the engagement began. She looked at Oscar directly. Someone designed this attack specifically to defeat an opponent following the rules. The ULSC did not protect Lieutenant Rael's unit. It was used as a weapon against them. The chamber was very quiet. You are making a serious allegation, Oscar said. I am making a documented one. The node is in evidence. The adaptation patterns are in evidence. The timeline of the communication blackout is in evidence. She held his gaze. I am not here to protect humanity from consequences. I am here because I witnessed something the law did not account for, and I carry the account, and I will not allow it to be simplified into a case about whether humans follow rules. Oscar looked at her for a long moment. You are aware, he said, that this testimony places you in direct opposition to the Korath position. I am aware, and to a significant portion of the Zyar High Command. I am aware of that also. And you proceed regardless. The obligation of survival, she said simply, is not conditional on whether it is convenient. Oscar turned and walked back to his position. His footsteps were heavier than usual, Rael thought, the weight of something not going as planned. In the gallery, Rael sat very still and looked at the top of Vora's head from 2 levels above and felt something that he did not immediately have a name for. It was not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was present. It was something more structural. The recognition that a thing he had not known was uncertain, had just become less uncertain, and that it had become less uncertain because someone had chosen to make it so at a cost they had calculated in advance and accepted. He thought about her saying, I will put my name to it in the bunker, in the amber dark, with drones circling outside. He thought about how long she had been carrying that decision. He left the gallery before the session ended. He did not want her to look up and see him there. It seemed important, somehow, that the testimony be hers completely, unwitnessed by the person it most directly concerned. He found Ton in the corridor outside the office. The old man was sitting on a bench with his data pad on his knee and his eyes closed, which he did sometimes in the afternoons, not sleeping but something adjacent to it, a stillness that Rael had learned to respect. He sat down beside him. She did it, Rael said. I know, Ton did not open his eyes. I was listening from the corridor. My knees declined the stairs. A silence. Ton, Rael looked at the wall across from them, old metal, old light. How are you? The old man was quiet for a moment. It was not a deflecting quiet. It was the quiet of someone choosing how much of a true thing to say. I am tired, he said finally, in a way that sleep does not address. He opened his eyes and looked at the data pad. This compact, I have been in this work for 30 years and I have not written anything that mattered as much as these 2 pages. I am aware that I may not be present when it is ratified if it is ratified. I have made my peace with that. A pause. Mostly. Rael looked at him. You'll be present, he said. Perhaps, Ton almost smiled. But the compact will exist regardless. That is what matters, not who is in the room when the vote comes, that the argument was made, that someone wrote it down. Rael thought about the sleeper tap in the conduit housing, about the node preserved carefully in an evidence container, carrying its information forward into rooms and decisions it had never been meant to reach, about Vora on the platform, setting her notes aside and speaking plainly, about 14 names he carried without ceremony, without audience, as a simple matter of obligation. Someone asked why the rules existed, he said. It was something Ton had said to him early in the process, and he had been turning it over ever since. Yes, Ton said, that is always the first step. They sat together in the corridor outside a small room where 217 pages of proposed galactic law waited in the recycled air. Tomorrow, Hana would take the platform. Tomorrow the conquered would move toward its vote. Tonight, an old man and a soldier sat on a bench that had probably held 1,000 people before them and would hold 1,000 after, and said nothing more because there was nothing more that needed saying. Somewhere on the station, Vora was walking back to her quarters through corridors designed to make everything feel inevitable. Carrying the cost of the morning's testimony in the specific way she carried everything, forward, without display, as a weight that changed the shape of a person and was not, among her people, considered a compliment. Rael hoped she knew that among his people it was. He did not know how to tell her that. He was not sure it was his to say. He sat with Ton until the old man's breathing evened out into the stillness that was not sleep, and then he sat a while longer, watching the corridor light do its patient work, illuminating nothing in particular and everything all at once. Hana had been awake since 300. She had not intended to be. She had laid out her notes the night before with the methodical care of someone who understood that preparation was the only honest answer to fear, and she had set a reasonable alarm, and she had lain in the dark of her small station quarters and listened to the recycled air move through the vents and thought about every version of tomorrow in which she failed. There were many versions. She was 29 years old and she had argued 3 cases before interplanetary arbitration panels and won 2 of them, which Ton had told her was an extraordinary record and which felt, from the inside, like having survived 2 situations that should have gone worse. She was not the most senior advocate in the human delegation. She was not the most decorated. She had been chosen because Ton believed she had something the senior advocates did not. And when she had asked him what that was he had said, "You still sound like you mean it," and she had not been sure whether that was a compliment or a diagnosis. She dressed in the dark and went to find him. He was in the office, as she had known he would be. The data pad on his knee, the cold tea at his elbow, the 2-page document on the screen in front of him that he had read, she suspected, several hundred times in the past week. He looked up when she came in and did not express surprise at the hour. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "Tell me what you're going to say." She told him. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Ton, who had opinions about sentence construction and the placement of pauses and the precise weight that certain words could bear before they became too heavy to land cleanly. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. "That's all. That is everything." He looked at her with the tired, careful eyes that had been looking at her this way for 3 years, since she had walked into his office as a junior advocate, and he had handed her a case file and said, "Tell me what you see. You know what you want to say. You know why it matters. The only thing left is to say it. There are 400 delegates in that chamber. There have always been 400 delegates in that chamber. They were there for every case that was ever argued and lost. They will be there for every case argued and won." He paused. "They are not the point. The point is the argument. The argument exists regardless of whether they accept it today." Hana looked at the document on his screen. 2 pages. The distillation of 30 years of Tan's work, 6 days of Rael's translation, and something that felt, reading it, like the entire weight of every war humanity had ever survived and learned from, and tried never to repeat. "He should be here," she said. "Rael." "He is here in every sense that matters," Tan said. She thought about that. About a soldier she had never met, sitting on a platform in this chamber 2 days ago, saying, "I don't know how to apologize for trying to a room full of beings who had wanted him to apologize for surviving." About the sleeper tap and the 14 names and the amber sky over a ruined outpost where someone had made a decision that had moved, through a series of events that no one had planned, all the way to this room, this morning. This 2-page document that proposed to change something fundamental about the way a galaxy understood its own violence. She thought about Vora, whom she had watched from the gallery yesterday with something approaching awe, not at the authority of the testimony, but at the cost of it. The visible, chosen cost of standing in a room and saying a true thing to people who had decided in advance that it was inconvenient. "I'm ready," Hana said. Tan nodded. She stood. He did not stand with her, his knees and the stairs. But as she reached the door, he said her name once, and she turned. "The rules," he said, "were written by the living for the living. That is all you need them to understand." She carried that with her down 3 levels and through the corridor that opened into the chamber's preparation area, where 2 aides from the delegation were waiting with last-minute documentation she did not need, and an expression of coordinated anxiety she found almost comforting in its familiarity. She did not look at the notes. She walked to the platform and stood for a moment looking at the chamber. 400 delegates. The tiered galleries above them holding observers, witnesses, junior staff, and one soldier in a familiar seat 2 levels up who she had been told would not be there and was. She began. The chamber was quiet in the way large spaces became quiet when everyone in them was paying the same quality of attention. Not silence exactly, but the suspension of everything that was not listening. Hana did not begin with the ULSC. She did not begin with Helios. She began with an older war, a human one, the kind fought on a single small planet before anyone had thought to look up and consider that the universe might be watching. She spoke about cities that had burned, about weapons designed to end all life on a world, about the long, terrible history of a species that had learned what violence could become when the rules stopped serving the living and started serving the logic of the conflict itself. She spoke plainly without performance, in the way Tan had asked of Rael and was now asking of her, not because the chamber deserved performance, but because the truth did not require it. She let it sit. She wanted them to understand that humans were not naive, not children who had arrived in space with clean hands and no knowledge of what war could cost. They had written their own doctrine of armed conflict, not from ignorance of rules, but from a specific, hard-earned understanding of what happened when rules forgot their purpose. Then she showed them the compact. 2 pages on the central screen in language so unadorned that it almost looked insufficient for the weight it was carrying. 5 principles: civilian protection absolute, genocide forbidden, the right to surrender honored, prisoners treated with basic dignity, weapons designed for unnecessary suffering prohibited. She looked at the chamber. Beyond these principles, she told them every species kept its own doctrine. The Korath could fight in open formation. Humanity would continue to fight in the way that saved the most lives. Others would find their own paths. But all of them, every single signatory, would be bound by the core. The things that made a civilization were not in how it fought. They were in who it protected. She stepped back from the platform. She did not say please. She did not perform humility she did not feel. She said what she had come to say, and she meant it, which was, she thought, the only version of this that Tan had believed she was capable of and that she now believed herself. The deliberation lasted 4 hours. Rael watched from the gallery without moving. The process was as Tan had described it. Not a vote, but a conversation, species by species, the accumulated positions of civilizations that had been making these calculations for longer than humanity had been writing things down. The powerful species resisted, and they resisted in the ways that powerful species always resisted change. By arguing that stability was the same as justice, that the existing framework's longevity was evidence of its fitness, that a new framework proposed by a junior species in the middle of its own legal defense was inherently suspect. The Vishari argued chaos. The Torvon argued vagueness. Oscar argued again that Earth should be punished regardless of any future reforms, and his voice carried the particular weight of a being who had decided that the argument was less important than the outcome he had determined in advance. Then the smaller species spoke. One by one, delegations that had been quiet for so long that their silence had become part of the room's architecture found something to say. A representative from the Lunari, small beings with soft voices who had lost 3 wars under ULSC rules, who had followed every protocol and been destroyed with perfect legal compliance, stood and said in a voice that did not waver, "We have followed the laws, we have always followed the laws, and we have always lost. If following the law means dying, then the law is broken." Others said versions of this. Different words, different species, the same weight, the accumulated testimony of civilizations that had been too afraid to challenge a system that was not working for them because challenging it meant standing up first, alone, in a room designed to make that feel presumptuous. A strange, young, reckless species from a small blue planet had stood up first. Rael watched this from 2 levels above and felt the particular vertigo of understanding that something he had been part of had become something larger than he could hold in his hands. He thought about Helios, about the specific reality of it, the smell of burnt metal in Aridin's amber sky, and the weight of a rifle at 22%. About the moment before Vora's ship arrived when he had been genuinely uncertain whether anything would come next. About the node in the conduit housing that had carried its small, patient testimony all the way here. He thought about 14 names. He did not say them aloud. He did not need to. They were present in the way that lost things were present, not as absence but as shape, as the specific contour of what the surviving person moved around and through and continued to carry. The final count was narrow. Rael did not realize he had been holding his breath until the result was announced, and he exhaled, and the sound of it surprised him. Earth acquitted of all charges. Formal negotiations on the Galactic Compact of Conflict to begin, with Earth and 12 other species forming the initial drafting committee. Oscar stood and walked out of the chamber without a word. His footsteps echoed in the sudden quiet, heavy, deliberate, the sound of a being who had decided that the correct response to losing was to leave before the room could see what losing looked like. Rael watched him go. Then he watched the 3 junior Korath officers who had come with Oscar and did not follow him out. They stayed in their seats. One of them was taking notes. He sat with that for a long time. The observation deck of the Steady Flame was empty when Rael found it, which was what he had wanted. The ship was an hour from departure, the docking clamp still holding them to Athos Prime's ancient frame, and through the viewport the station filled the lower third of the view old metal that caught no light from the dead star it circled. A structure that had outlasted the sun it was built beside, and continued to function regardless, housing the deliberations of a galaxy that was trying, imperfectly, to decide what it owed its smallest members. He stood at the viewport for a while without thinking about anything in particular. This happened sometimes after sustained intensity, the mind running quiet, not because there was nothing in it, but because it had briefly used all available capacity and required a moment of simple function before resuming. He heard footsteps and knew them before he turned. Vora stood in the doorway of the observation deck. She was in civilian dress, the Zyar equivalent, structured and dark, without insignia. She looked less like a commander than usual, which is to say she looked exactly like a commander who had chosen not to announce it. "I thought you would have left already," Rael said. "My transport departs in 2 hours." She crossed the deck and stood beside him at the viewport. Not close, but not at the distance she had maintained in the early days at Helios, when proximity to a human had seemed to require deliberate management. "I wanted to see this before I left." They looked at the station together. "Your advocate was good," Vora said. "She was." She sounded like she meant it. "She did," Rael paused. "Tan chose her for that." "The old man," Vora was quiet for a moment. "How is he?" "Tired." He thought of Tan on the bench in the corridor, the data pad on his knee, eyes closed in the not-sleep that was something adjacent to peace. "He gave everything he had to the compact. I think he knew he would. I think he decided that was the correct use of what he had left." Vora absorbed this in the way she absorbed most things, without immediate response, taking it somewhere internal to be examined properly. "Among my people," she said, There is a ceremony for soldiers who have completed something significant, not a celebration, more like a formal acknowledgement that the weight has been carried and set down and that the person is still standing. She looked at the viewport. I have been trying to determine the correct human equivalent. Rael looked at her. There isn't one, he said. We tend to just keep going. That is both admirable and deeply inefficient. He almost laughed. It surprised him, the almost laugh, the way it arrived without warning from somewhere he hadn't accessed in a long time. Vora looked at him when it happened. Her expression was unreadable in the specific way. It became unreadable when she was processing something she hadn't prepared for. Your testimony cost you, Rael said, with your command. Yes. Was it, he stopped, reformulated. Do you regret it? She considered this with the seriousness she brought to questions that deserved it. I regret nothing that is true, she said finally. I may regret in time some of the consequences, but the testimony was true. The compact is necessary. The argument needed to be made by someone who was not human, and I was there, and I knew what I had seen. She paused. Verath, the obligation does not ask whether the cost is convenient. No, Rael said, it doesn't. They stood together in silence. The station turned slowly in the dead starlight, massive and patient, doing what it had been doing for centuries, holding the space where difficult things were decided, indifferent to the outcome, present for all of it. I want to ask you something, Vora said. Ask. At Helios, the darts. She looked at him directly. You moved before you had decided. I have thought about this many times. You did not weigh options. You did not calculate. You simply moved. There wasn't time. There is never time, she said. That is not what I am asking. She held his gaze. I am asking whether you knew in that moment that I was worth saving, or whether it did not matter who I was. Rael looked at her. At the question underneath the question, which was not about the darts, not really, but about what kind of thing he had done and what it meant that she had been the recipient of it. Whether she had been saved because she was valuable or because saving was simply what he did. Both, he said honestly. It didn't matter who you were and you were worth saving. Those aren't opposites. She was quiet for a long moment. No, she said finally, they are not. The docking clamps released with a sound that moved through the ship's frame rather than the air, a deep mechanical exhale, the station letting go. The steady flame began its slow drift away from Athos Prime, and the station moved from filling the lower third of the viewport to filling less than that, to becoming one large object among many, to becoming simply part of the view. Tan appeared in the doorway of the observation deck. He took in the scene, Rael and Vora at the viewport, the station receding, with the expression of someone who had lived long enough to recognize when a moment was complete and required nothing from him. He came to stand beside Rael anyway, because he was Tan, and he had always believed that presence mattered even when words did not. A good day, he said. A beginning, Rael said. Tan almost smiled. Beginnings are the hardest part. Vora looked at the old man. Something in her expression was careful and sincere in equal measure. Your compact will be argued over for years, she said. Some species will refuse to sign. Some will sign and not honor it. Some will honor it imperfectly. Yes, Tan said. And you believe it is worth doing regardless. I believe, Tan said with a weight of 30 years behind it, that the galaxy asked why the rules existed today. It had not asked that question before. Once the question exists, it cannot be made not to exist. He looked at the viewport. The rest is just persistence. Vora looked at the station, now small enough to hold in one eye's field of vision. Ancient metal in dead starlight. A place where the powerful had been deciding the fates of others for a very long time, and where today something small and stubborn had complicated that. I will advocate for Zayar signing, she said. I cannot guarantee the outcome, but I will advocate. Neither Rael nor Tan responded immediately, because the statement did not require response. It required only acknowledgement, the simple witnessing of a decision that had been made and would now be carried forward in the way all decisions were carried, one day at a time, through the ordinary persistence of people who had decided that a thing mattered. Rael looked at the stars ahead of them. The long road back to a small blue planet that had done something today it would spend years understanding the implications of. Not because humans were the strongest or the most ancient or the most strategically positioned. Because they had been broken once by their own violence and had put themselves back together around a single stubborn conviction, that the only rule worth following was the one that kept people alive. He thought about the 14 names. He thought about the amber sky. He thought about a rifle at 22% and 5 metallic darts and an alien commander asking why in a tone that was not quite a question, because she had no language prepared for the answer she had received. He thought about the 3 junior Korath officers who had stayed in their seats. One of them had been taking notes. That was enough. It was not everything, it was nowhere near everything, but it was the kind of beginning that Tan was right about. The hardest kind. The kind that required someone to move before they had decided in the direction of the thing that needed doing, without guarantee of outcome and without apology for trying. The steady flame turned toward home. The stars ahead stretched and held their positions and offered nothing except the fact of their distance and the direction they provided. Behind them, the galaxy was different than it had been before. Not fixed, not saved, not certain. Different. And sometimes, Rael thought,